This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Roque Ceguera again swam the icy cold river to attach the rope, and one at a time the boats made it across the river. Once the last boat made it across safely, Ceguera remained on the American side. This time, Navarrete wanted to see what was beyond the banks of the river. He could see a barbed wire entanglement up ahead, and ordered one of the men to go cut a hole through it. Rivera positioned his machine gun at the ready. As the T-Patcher cut through the wire, the German machine guns opened up on him. Rivera saw the German machine guns, and followed by Navarrete, they moved quickly to flank the guns. The live bait T-Patcher made it back safely, away from the wire. A bullet had grazed his back, but he was not seriously wounded. Years later in an interview, Navarrete would admit that by sending the soldier to cut the wire, he knew that would bring the German machine guns down on him. But it was the only way to locate the German positions and outflank them. Rivera opened up with his machine gun, and some T-Patchers tossed a few grenades towards the Germans. After a few blasts, the enemy machine gun was still pumping out lead, until Rivera fired a few more bursts, and it was silenced. Just then, 2 to 3 more German machine guns opened up on their position. Rivera fired his machine gun toward the muzzle flashes. When one German machine gun stopped firing, he started on a new target. With a sudden roar, German flares turned night into day. With the assistance of the flares, the Germans now started firing mortar rounds into the T-Patcher's position. Navarrete could see that they were taking machine gun fire from nearly every direction and ordered the men back to the river. It was an order that did not have to be repeated. One mortar shell landed, wounding Rivera, who was still firing his machine gun. One of the men had to literally pull Rivera back as he was still firing while swearing at the Germans in Spanish. Navarrete was firing his Thompson submachine gun when a mortar round landed, wounding his right shoulder. He stayed behind to cover the retreat of his men. Navarrete spotted a German soldier walking slowly in his direction. The German did not see him and nearly walked right into him when Navarrete fired a few rounds into his chest. He could now hear more voices heading his way, so Navarrete grabbed his knife and opened up the German soldier. He took some blood, wiped it all over his face, and laid there. A few Germans walked up to him and kicked him aside, thinking he was dead. He laid there, not moving, for it felt like an eternity, or at least until he no longer could hear the Germans. He was badly wounded and bleeding, but he had to try and swim. To his surprise, most of his men were still on the German side of the river. They had hid there waiting for him to show up. A few men had tried to get back across in their rubber boats, but German mortar fire had made Swiss cheese out of their rafts, and they had to swim back to the German side of the river. Van Smith had also been wounded in his right arm. He was in bad shape. They put some of the wounded in a boat and pulled it to the other side. They brought back the boat because they had lost a few during the evening. It was a tedious task, but they slowly tried to get everyone back to the American side of the river. Rivera urged Navarrete to go in one of the first boats, but he refused. And although wounded, Rivera refused to go until Navarrete was put on a boat. Another boat arrived back on the German side, and Navarrete and Rivera got aboard and started back to the American side of the river. Before they reached halfway, the Germans spotted them and started firing mortar rounds. One shell hit directly in the center of the rubber boat, tearing through the center. It did not explode until it hit the bottom of the river. The men quickly jumped out of the sinking boat and swam back to the German side. Captain Chapin, Lieutenant Barker, and Lieutenant Richard M. Manton were in the command post when Roque Ceguera ran in and advised the officers that part of the patrol was trapped on the other side of the river. Lieutenant Manton had just transferred over to Company E from Company F. Meanwhile, Navarrete and Rivera waited for another boat to arrive. Lieutenant Barker would later recall. Chapin arrived at the river crossing. There he found some of the new men scared and disorganized and not fighting or helping to get the rest of the men back. He took over the situation. He stood up on the bank of the river and shouted orders and got the men who were not wounded to help. Artillery and mortar shells were pouring in and pounded the whole area. The captain still stood on his feet and pulled the ropes and was shouting encouragement and orders to the men, regardless of the fierce enemy fire. Lieutenant Manton got in a boat, crossed, and helped Navarrete and Rivera finally reach the American side of the river. Captain Chapin and Major Landry were waiting. They quickly helped the wounded, freezing men. Of the 7 rubber boats used by the patrol, Only 2 made it back in usable condition.